Vignesh, it's about time, right? Shall we start?
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay. Good evening and good day to all our participants. Thank you for joining us today for the webinar Political Risk, Businesses and Climate Change Cases from South and Southeast Asia. My name is Suraj, and on behalf of entire Covens team, I welcome you to the final webinar in the series of webinars on the theme Climate Change, Environmental Security, and Political Risk, organized by PRISM Department of Covens in collaboration with the Center for Climate Studies, Manipal Academy of Higher Education. Few important things before we start. This webinar series intends to give the audience an idea on various interlinked topics related to climate change and political risks. And we hope for this to be a learning experience for all of us. At the end of this webinar, you will receive a certificate acknowledging your attendance via email. Additionally, participants who have attended all these sessions will receive a certificate of participation at the end of the series from Covens. I would like to go over a few ground rules before we begin the session. The speakers will present consecutively and then we will open for questions. By default, all participants are muted. However, we want this to be an engaging discussion, so we encourage you to use the Q&A section to ask questions and participate in the polls so that the speaker can get a sense of the audience. The speaker will take the questions at the end of their presentation. While typing out your questions, please mention whom the question is addressed to, otherwise it will be open to both the speakers. In case you cannot hear the speaker clearly or if there is a lag, please refresh your browser. Do not exit the webinar. You may not be able to log in again. Now, to give you a brief about us before we kick off, Covert Overt Intelligence Solutions, aka Covens, is headquartered in Bangalore. At Covens, we pride ourselves on our ability to work under critical situations whilst maintaining the highest standards and delivering the optimal solutions. Political Risk and Intelligence Services Management, PRISM, is a division of Covens focusing on providing customized solutions for interested stakeholders in the areas of political risks, focusing on geopolitics, geoeconomics, socioeconomics, and socio-political risk areas. To know more about our various products and services, you can visit our website or get in touch with us directly. The Center for Climate Studies at Manipal Academy of Higher Education, Manipal, aims to undertake high impact, multidisciplinary, problem driven research for end to end solutions on climate change and to create a pool of researchers to serve the growing need for sustainable climate policy, governance, and diplomacy. Moving on to our topic, it is widely known and accepted that climate change and subsequent warming of our planet is happening at an accelerated pace. This has deep impact on every section of society. While this remains a fact, an astute understanding of the problem, its impact, and the necessary solutions still seem to be far off. This is especially true when it comes to South and Southeast Asia. From this webinar session, we hope to uncover some of these key points and try to understand what the future holds in store for us. So let us welcome our first speaker for today, Dr. Vignesh Ram. Dr. Vignesh Ram is a security and political risk analyst with a PhD in geopolitics and international relations. He specializes in the domestic, regional, and international policies in Southeast Asian countries and within the ASEAN organization with a focus on ASEAN decision making. Dr. Vignesh holds considerable experience in multiple research and analytical roles in organizations in the field of science and technology, politics, and businesses in India and abroad. He also briefly taught international relations in Manipal University. It is a pleasure to have you with us this evening, Dr. Vignesh. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Suraj. So I think I will just, if you can, I will just launch the presentation, and I'll be glad if you can just operate the presentation, and we'll move forward. So good evening to one and all who's joined us here, and I'm glad that after a long time, in fact, I've got a chance to speak on the domestic politics and the political risk, especially focusing on Southeast Asia. And with this, I think it's a very integral part of this region. In fact, if we have looked into any aspect, whether it's in terms of travel or whether it's in terms of trade or security, risks related to climate change and environment are at the apex when considering any of these aspects in Southeast Asia. Next slide, please. Okay. So this is general format which I'll be following throughout this presentation. In fact, first it's important to locate where political risk figures in political where climate change factors in terms of political risk. Then we look at what are the various aspects in the business impact which happens in this region. And also, finally, we'll go on to mapping the disaster and environmental threats in Southeast Asia and look at certain cases and conclude with some observations. So, when we talk about political risk, what we do need to understand is that many a times, many of these risks, which we classify in different compartments, are mostly interrelated. And when we are talking about climate change, more so that if you look at the pre-COVID world, if we can call it that at this point of time, the top risks in the for businesses were dominated by climate change. At least in the top five risks, climate change used to figure as one of the major risks for major companies, insurers, consultants, global bodies. You take any of the organizations, used to classify climate change as a major challenge for the way of life as we know it. And some of the interesting surveys, if you see, even which were conducted in the late part of 2019, what we realize is that climate change remains what we call as the known unknown. Everybody knows it's there. Everybody knows we're feeling the effect of it, but little was done, especially from the business side, to deal with this or look at this as a major problem affecting many parts of business. Going forward, this presentation will try to unravel that aspect of it before moving on to the case on Southeast Asia. One of the surveys conducted. One of the surveys conducted on how majority of the CFOs, for instance, in Europe, of the major companies looked at climate change, the problem. They use keywords such as they saw it in the form of a short-term cost-saving effect. Uh, there was a lack of thorough understanding of the impact or this subject, or the lack of mechanisms to develop strategies were not there, or the compliance for companies was not in alignment with global policies. Now, if we look at 215 biggest global companies, as this came with the a report by the Carbon Disclosure Project, we see that 215 biggest global companies almost report 1 trillion risk from climate impacts to hit within the next 5 years. And this report had come out this year. And despite the fact that we are going through a pandemic which we have not seen of this proportion for a very long time, climate change still continues to be a major problem in terms of how businesses see this issue. However, there are also certain geopolitical, geoeconomic impacts which this has, and one of them is on the changing theaters of war and conflict. Conflicts these days are not only concentrated or looked at in the traditional sense, but what we can also see is that the theaters of war and conflict get altered by the impacts of this. One of the examples could be complicating of changing maritime boundaries between countries, the changing status of individuals rendered stateless due to their disappearing lands or their disappearing parts of their countries, and the absence of a global consensus has been one of the major problems in terms of who has to do how much in terms of tackling this issue. And the conservative backsliding, if we can put it that way, has been on agreements has been a major challenge for this. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Now, what are the impacts? Now, if we look at the basic risk factors, whether it's a geopolitical risk, a geoeconomic risk, and the socio-political and socio-economic risk, we see that in the impact is actually most felt in the geopolitical space on business continuity. The altered position of conflicts and war, the resource conflicts that may result as a the changing environment, and also the loss of territory and states can complicate matters in which business is conducted. And in the geoeconomic space, there is a more direct impact on the operations and the organization themselves. We have all been, to give you one example, if we remember the floods which happened in Thailand, a large amount of the supply chain for electronics was disrupted, automobiles was disrupted. Now, this has a direct impact on the supply chain of certain commodities. And if you look at the freak incidents which happen, or the climate related incidents which happen, which have been aggravated due to the changing weather patterns, you see that this also has a great impact on the industries. And if you see that one more aspect of this is also the direct loss which is occurred when production facilities or others are impacted. And of course, when we come to the socio-economic and the socio-political part, their impact is felt on all spheres of operations of business. But however, there are also positives when we look at these aspects. And but the key for this is that threats need not only be mitigated, but there should also be a uh, effort to adapt to these type of threats with a futuristic perspective in mind. Now, the positives of this is that in a survey which was conducted, it was highlighted that companies in the financial sector see the most potential revenue to the tune of $1.2 trillion from potential new sustainable products and services, followed by manufacturing, services, and fossil fuels. In fact, which is surprising, the survey sees that, and the food, beverage, and agricultural industries do also see a positive from migrating towards a more sustainable form of business. Next slide, please. Now we move on to the poll, which we put out generally in terms of the generally for the audience to interact with us. And I would just request Suraj to just turn on the poll. So the question here for the poll is that what is the biggest risk challenge for countries in Southeast Asia? And we're moving on further. We will discuss about these, but it would be good to know a perspective from the audience. The audience can just select one of the options and click submit so that we know we can proceed further. Suraj, can we have the results for the poll, please, if people are
Uh,
voting?
yeah. So we have impacts of climate change due to unsustainable infrastructure development at 29%, and at a close second at 25%, we have developmental economic challenges, socio-economic challenges.
Okay, so moving on further from this, we'll go back to the presentation. Yeah. So how do we look at mapping the disaster and environmental threats in Southeast Asia? There are certain factors to consider if you look on your left-hand side. And if you look in the boxes, what we do see is that these are potential areas which are impacted by climate change. This is, of course, the map of Southeast Asia. And there are various factors which play a key role in this. And if we look at one of the aspects, for instance, which is the socio-economic problems such as poverty, hunger, undernourishment, one of the boxes in the top right hand side, it's right almost in the center of your screen, is that of the Mekong River Basin. And the problems which are getting added on due to the environmental security challenges is that the problem is more manifested in poorer nations in this, such as Laos and Cambodia. And when we look at Cambodia and Vietnam, they are facing challenges of depletion of fishing stocks, for instance. For the Mekong River Basin remains one of the most one of the highest ranging fish stocks available anywhere along this region. And the depletion of fishing stocks and the loss of land and housing has been one of the key challenges with these type of socio-economic developments. Now, there is also close rivalry by the geopolitical tensions and also the ambitions of powers in this region. Now, for instance, China has been funding and building dams in Laos, and while the South China Sea rapid island building has also been one of the key aspects. And here is how all the major threats are intertwined, and there is an impact on the functioning of this ecosystem. So similarly, the region is also disaster prone, and those who are familiar would be seeing that this region is prone to to earthquakes, tsunamis. There is also a natural system here known as the Pacific Ring of Fire, which runs along the fault lines which are there, and these are also known for heightened seismic activity around this region and can also be focused. So the focus here, due to this, is heightened because of the disaster, the lack of the socio-economic conditions here, and the lack of ability to tackle large-scale disasters which have been occurring for a very long period of time. And this also places very huge challenges for disaster plans which have been placed, such as the Sendai Action Plan on Disaster Reduction, for instance, which was launched by the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. So this faces additional challenges, and industrialization has been one of the key issues, and the linkages of these countries, especially for instance Vietnam, the countries to the global supply chains, also adds to the challenges to environmental issues which the region faces. Now, for instance, demand for FMCG commodities such as palm oil or technology components from this region, um, there have been previous instances, like I highlighted before, that there have been issues which have been faced. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So I would like to now touch upon certain cases from Southeast Asia, and how these occurrences which are happening directly or indirectly are impacted or impact climate change. And one is, of course, about the transboundary haze. Now, it's a yearly phenomenon which is closely linked to the aspects of deforestation, global demand for resources, and domestic politics in these countries. Um, Now, this annual haze occurs because of a phenomena where there is a burning of palm oil plantations after the uh, after the cultivation, and this causes a thick plummet of smoke to blow across the Malacca Strait towards Singapore and Malaysia. And now there have been socio-economic and political factors which have hampered the domestic mitigation of these issues. One of them, for instance, has been there are strong voter constituencies which form a major vote bank in countries of this region, and any action to move against this also causes some problems. Now, adding to the worsening air quality, also there one of the major challenges has been forest fires, and these have been from 2019. If you see, one of the worst blazes in Indonesia and Sumatra, causing another huge round of problems, and which was aggravated by, of course, a dry spell and weather changes. So here you see how all of these factors come together, and one of the major problems has been also the demand for resources from this, which has resulted in huge biodiversity loss in Indonesia, especially. And if you see Malaysia and Indonesia together, they account for close to 80% of the global palm oil production in the world. So, tackling these issues such as haze has been a challenge, and it has been intragovernmental action has been accelerated to an extent where states of the affected region have started to take action. And one of these major actions is that countries in the region, if they couldn't collectively do much, they started individually penalizing their companies operating in Indonesia, which used to run these palm oil plantations. And if they could not take any actions, they were penalized back at home. So this was one of the ways in which they were tackling this problem. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Now, of course, we discussed briefly about the Mekong River Basin, and the intense amount of dams which have been built along the Mekong River, which is the lifeline of certain mainland Southeast Asian states such as Cambodia and Vietnam, there has been a key problem. And one of the issues has been that these countries remain poor. For instance, if we look at the Asia Pacific Disaster Report of 2019, we do see that population exposure to drought prone areas is very high, and this also is aggravated by the changing climatic conditions in this region. And for instance, if you look at why certain countries are able to mitigate or take actions against climate proofing themselves, what we see is that poorer countries face a bigger challenge, because one, they do not have as much access to finance in terms of taking sustained measures, and also there is an element of extra regional geopolitical concern, which uh, for instance, China's infrastructure building and infrastructure spree within Southeast Asia forms a very big part of this. And not only China, but if you see that the aid diplomacy which happens in these, what we term collectively as the CLMV countries, also plays a role. Uh, and one of the major problems has been the lack of water flowing into the Gulf of Thailand in the Mekong River Delta, which straddles between Cambodia and Vietnam. And what we see here is that the intense dam building has led to lesser outflow into the Delta region, which is one of known to be a very fertile region anywhere in the world. And the summers have led to more salination along the Delta region and creating more problems for agriculture. And of course, when we talk about the fishing stocks, of course, I touched upon this before, and the rapidly depleting fishing stocks have added to a major problem in this for the countries which sustain on these resources. And if we see that this in turn also affects the political stability in these countries, and the risk of reliance on how it feeds into the global economy is also affected. One of the good examples is that about Vietnam and the high industrialization along the delta regions of the Mekong River. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Now, finally, we cannot really consider consider the impact of issues such as territorial disputes or any type of conflict on what it has on impact it has on the environment. And interestingly so, when we have looked at the South China Sea dispute, we see at military posturing, or we see the military capability of states. But what we do also need to look at is what impact is this having on the environment in the region. Now, for instance, if you see on the bottom screen, bottom image, we see that there is something known as a coral triangle. It is one of the biggest biodiversity spots in the world, and it contains a huge amount of undersea life and corals, which are very useful, or which are very interesting to note. And we see that there are basically 100. While we're looking at the South China Sea dispute, what we also see is that a lot of it is focused on fishing vessels entering each other's territorial waters. And what we do notice here is that one of the studies, for instance, which was done along China's coast, it did recognize that in the East Sea, the East China Sea, the Yellow Sea, and the South China Sea, which were in China's periphery, the East Sea and the Yellow Sea had soon started showing signs that fish stocks are depleting, and this is due to the warming of the oceans. And and the South China Sea, for instance, was not showing as much impact as these two other parts of the sea surrounding China. And this could be one of the reasons, due to the abundance of fish, that there is also a push towards these countries towards China to lay its claim. And one of the ways in which it has also tried to enforce its claim is by pushing in state-sponsored huge fishing armadas into this region. And the other aspect of this is also the impact artificial island building has on the destruction of marine ecosystems in this region. Now, for instance, another study done on the nature of the corals in the South China Sea, especially in the Spratly Islands, it says that to compare and contrast another region, compared to the Great Barrier Reef, which sees about 0.1 to 0.5% of fishing boats per reef. Chinese fishing boats in the reefs in the South China Sea, which controls, it's close to about 100 to 150 fishing vessels per reef. So that is the scale at which we are seeing a whole activity which is happening over there. And this has caused immense damage to the coral reefs, and apart from the bleaching which happens due to the climate change effects. If we can move on to the second poll and the next slide. Um, so with this, be interesting to know from the audience what they think about the second poll before I move on to the concluding slide in my presentation. So you've seen the impacts. Who do you think really should take action for effects on environmental risks? Should it be a top-down approach where the government takes the action? Should be corporates or companies which should take it upon themselves to really do their part, or it should just be the citizen? They should move on to do that.
All right, we still have a couple of votes coming in, but I think there's a clear winner here. It's the governments, is what most people are saying. So,
Yeah. Okay. So if we can move on to our final concluding slide, and in fact, our audience's response has been very interesting in terms of this, is because as Dr. Dhanashree would uh, speak about in her next presentation, the action at the global level has been a little disappointing, but at the state and regional levels, as we have seen in terms of Southeast Asia or in terms of the ASEAN organization, it has been somewhat lukewarm. So moving on to the conclusion, there are certain pointers which we need to remember in terms of how we see this whole issue. And while we look at the ASEAN organization's approach, which is the major regional organization, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, what we see is that there were initial challenges in terms of forging a regional consensus on how to combat something like the situation regarding the haze, the transboundary haze, what we spoke about in the beginning. For instance, domestic interests always trumped regional interests, where we saw that Indonesia for a long time was hesitant in signing the transboundary haze agreement in ASEAN. And of course, going by the ASEAN community framework, which has been put into place, environmental sustainability forms a key component of that. And now balancing that with economic development and growth, we see that there has been a challenge for every developing nation, of course, for a point of time. And in the case of rapid damming of the Mekong, for instance, the balance is very hard to notice in terms of whether it should be economic development or growth. And of course, incentivizing businesses or building them to adapt to more sustainable practices, for instance, could be a way forward. And here is where the political risk aspect comes about. And unless there is an approach to move towards these areas, such as sustainable energy generation through renewable energy, for instance, this could continue to remain a challenge. And Southeast Asia, for instance, remains a region which is quite prone to the effects of climate change. And adaptation and not only mitigation should be the final target when we are talking about these issues. So that's about it from my side. Thank you so much.
Full presentation. Just a few key takeaways before we move on to Dr. Dhanashree. So it was very interesting when you started off. You mentioned this term, the known unknown. I think that is, that's a very interesting term actually, because it's before you started your presentation, even I clearly mentioned it. This is it's a fact. It's happening around us, and it's happening right now. But yeah, I mean, there's not just much of acknowledgement, and like you said in your conclusion statements, it's not part of the sustainable development practice so far. It's not being implemented at the rate that it should be. And you then went on to mention the lack of developmental strategies. This can be seen across the world, and you also stated how this also can be seen in terms of increasing war and conflict due to climate change. And apart from the example that you provided, another very prime example is what's happening in the Sahel region, with delayed rainfalls and extreme drought. There is a lot of conflict between various tribes in the Sahel region, and that's creating a lot of problem. Not a lot of reporting being done on that, but yeah, nonetheless, it's happening. Then you covered well on the impact of climate change on geopolitics, geoeconomics, and socio-economic factors. And then you went on to mapping the disaster and environmental threats in Southeast Asia. And one key point that you mentioned over there is the depletion of fishing stock. Apart from us overfishing, overfishing that is happening by various countries in the region, it is also because of accelerated heating and lack of habitat that is severely disrupting the food chain. And the food chain is a very important component, and it's not independent of each other. Like, it's that's why we call it the food chain. It's dependent on, from the smallest organisms to the largest ones on this planet, and disrupting that will have severe impact on all of us, all the creatures on the planet. um, Another, then you went on to cover two cases. The first one was a transboundary haze, talking about the haze produced due to the production of palm oil and its effects. And the second one was the Mekong River Basin, and where you spoke about the drought faced by the large population in the region. One of the very interesting facts you mentioned over there was the climate proofing done by rich countries. It's just I find that very interesting actually, and I just want to add another statement to that. While it might be possible that with the resources and money you have, you are climate proofing yourself, ultimately the problem is going to reach you. Just take coronavirus for an example. All the amount of money in the world, if you're not taking care of it by wearing mask or protecting yourself, self isolation, it's really not going to help. The money is just going to come into effect when you go for treatment. Might as well prevent it than trying to go for the cure, right? So yeah, this is a very interesting presentation laid out by you, and thank you so much for that. And right now we will be moving on to just a small introduction about Dr. Dhanashree Jairam. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations and coordinator at the Center for Climate Studies, Manipal Academy of Higher Education. She is also a research fellow with Earth Systems Governance and a project associate with Manipal Advanced Research Group. Dr. Jairam is also a member of the Climate Security Expert Network, supported by a grant from the German Federal Foreign Office, run by the Berlin-based think tank Adelphi. It's a pleasure to have you with us this evening. Over to you, Dr. Dhanashree.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just going to upload the presentation. Okay. So thank you once again for having me in this webinar. And it's a pleasure to be the final speaker in this webinar series, which ran for an entire month. And we've had quite a few exciting sessions before this. And I'm very happy that we've had brilliant responses from the audience from various corners of the world. In fact, we've had really wonderful response. And it's good to see that topics like these related to climate change, environmental security are gaining a lot of momentum. And, especially at a time like this, as Suraj mentioned, when we are facing something like the COVID-19 pandemic and we don't know how to respond in most cases. I think climate change, even though we know how to respond in many cases, still there is so much of gap in terms of science and policy, or in terms of the solutions that are available and how much everybody is ready to act. And thankfully, since Vignesh has covered a lot about what political risk encompasses and what are the various environmental risks that are posed to any particular region, like whatever he talked about in terms of Southeast Asia can also be applied in the case of South Asia, but of course with varied contextual differences that obviously exist. So I'm not going. I don't have a format per se. I'm not going to delve into everything related to South Asia and the environmental risks and businesses and political risk and so on. But I would mostly be talking about various risks. Of course, that will be like an introductory slide, and then after that, I will be mostly talking about the kind of solutions also that are being implemented at the regional scale and the lack of regional cooperation. So Vignesh mentioned that in Southeast Asia, the response has been lukewarm. And you look at South Asia, the regional integration or cooperation is in fact, it's just terrible. There is absolutely, there is a huge lack of cooperation between the states in the region, despite the fact that there are many problems that these states, these nation states or these countries share. So therefore, the dismal kind of regional cooperation that is happening, except on some issues like disasters, there is some level of cooperation between some countries. Again, it is not a SAARC or South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation kind of a response. And at the same time, you have river water sharing agreements that have been signed. But again, these agreements that we are talking about do not take climate change into consideration. So how do we exactly factor in climate change into the risk posed by various kinds of changes that happen in the weather, like the southwest monsoon or anything? Or the glacial melt that happens in the Himalayan region? How does that affect the river water sharing agreements? Is something that is yet to be looked into in a much greater way. Okay, so as I mentioned, these are the projections, and this is taken from a report that I authored for the Climate Security Expert Network that Suraj also mentioned. And these are the risks that you can look at in terms of the annual mean temperature rising, the frequency of extreme weather events increasing, sea level rise, increased severity of drought and heat waves, increased unpredictability of precipitation patterns, increasing flooding risks and glacial melt. All these are some of the major risks posed by climate change in this region. Now, if you look at the sectors, again, if you look at the sectors, what I've mentioned here and what Vignesh mentioned in the case of Southeast Asia, they're not very different. You have agriculture, which is affected obviously by weather variability. And if you have changing climatic patterns, you also have to change the way in which farmers have been cultivating crops for such a long period of time. The traditional ways will have to be replaced by newer ways. Or how does that affect livelihood insecurity, for instance? We are already in the middle of an agrarian crisis, especially in India, as everybody knows. And how is climate change factored into saving the agricultural sector is something that is yet to be completely laid out by the government or other agencies that are responsible for the sector. Fisheries is obviously another one, which again was mentioned by Vignesh in his presentation. Water availability and quality, flood risk associated with water, and the fact that we have destroyed our wetlands, we have destroyed our mangroves is something that we need to also think about as we move into facing more and more risks associated with climate change. Human health, of course, COVID-19 is not caused by climate change. Of course, you cannot say that, but you also cannot say that many other diseases that are, say, for instance, you have malaria, dengue, those kind of fevers, which were not really there in the Himalayan region because of the cold conditions earlier, now because of the increasing temperatures are now there in those regions as well. So you have vector-borne diseases spreading into various regions. And of course, you have diseases associated with floods and drought as well that we need to think about. loss of biodiversity and coastal and forest degradation, reduced wetlands, as I spoke about, and how that leads to floods. I will come to that in the next slide, in fact. And of course, infrastructure and industry. And I think that is the main point, which also was brought about by Vignesh. And what we also need to think is that this is not something that is completely impervious of any impact on the economy. And I think that is something the industry, the governments, and the corporate sector is increasingly realizing, that this has a huge impact on the economic output of a particular country, or of the profits of a particular business. I mean, just think about how much losses the insurance industry must be making because of the kind of floods that are happening. Of course, in India, the insurance penetration is extremely low, so you cannot really figure in that. But in the Western countries, in the US, in some of the European countries as well, the insurance industry is now taking the lead in responding to climate change, because they are feeling the heat at the end of the day. So those are some of the sectors that. Okay. Yeah. So as I mentioned, slide is just appearing. Yeah, so this is the picture from Assam. I don't know how many of you are reading about what's happening in Assam, and how many of you are taking it seriously. That is another point, because this has become an annual phenomenon. People are probably taking it as something that happens annually. It doesn't have to be a big problem. We need to adapt to the changes. Of course, if you listen to some of the interviews with the government of Assam, or other engineering experts and otherwise, they would tell you, okay, just embankments is a solution that is provided mostly by these experts, and you can just see what has happened to the embankments. Most of them are breached, possibly because they have not been built properly, or because of corruption and other things. But also, we need to remember that this is a river. Brahmaputra is a river that we are talking about, and it's a huge, it's a mighty river that is so difficult to controls. And the idea here is to control the flood somehow. So you're building embankments everywhere, and the technocratic solutions are not really proving to be very effective year after year. And it's also important to remember that if you look at the cities in Assam, they are all growing. The population size is increasing as well. The wetlands are being encroached. So where does the river really go? And this is not something that is just a story of Assam. It's a story of Bihar. It has become a story of a state like Kerala. It is a story that is just across the region. In fact, you will find floods happening in Bangladesh, which is again an annual thing. But learning to adapt with the floods is something that is happening at a much better level than in India, for that matter. Okay, next slide here. Yeah, okay. So this is a slide that explains how really climate change affects coastal cities. Now, why I'm taking the case of coastal cities is again because you have cities like Mumbai, Chennai, Kolkata. We saw how the tropical cyclone Amphan affected Kolkata severely. We have seen how floods have affected Chennai in the past. We have seen Mumbai getting affected by floods again and again. And this year we've seen floods in many other places. Delhi was flooded as well. And this is something that is happening so much. And one thing that we need to remember is, as much as we think about climate change, we also need to think about our infrastructure development. And I'm very glad that in the poll that was given by Vignesh, the audience chose the second question. And I can understand why, because second option. And I can understand why, because infrastructure development has mostly gone against the laws of nature. I mean, one of the classic examples I always give is that of the Cochin International Airport, which is built in a floodplain. And I heard that many of the infrastructure that has come up in Assam is also built in wetlands. So groundwater extraction, another thing. So most people are moving from rural to urban areas with the population size increasing in urban cities, and the urbanization kind of going in a very unplanned manner. Groundwater extraction is also increasing. And with that, many Indian cities, in fact, according to recent studies, show that many Indian cities are sinking. Rather than sea level rise engulfing the coastal cities, it's mostly because cities are actually subsiding. Now, that is very important to remember as well, as we talk about how do we adapt coastal cities. which are also, by the way, they are also the economic powerhouses of most countries. Vignesh said about Bangkok. Then you have Jakarta as another example, which is now being moved as a capital, is being moved to an interior place. So Southeast Asia is just one part, and then you have South Asian cities as well. Karachi is another one. So you have all these coastal cities which are severely affected by sea level rise and storm surges and subsidence and so on. So this is another case now. Most people don't associate locust invasion with climate change. Now, how does a locust invasion take place? And I think this particular infographic just provides you enough reason to believe that that locust swarms are, of course, they are assisted by rainy conditions. And when enough rain is brought by the Indian Ocean to these regions which have been affected by locust swarms for 2 consecutive years. In fact, this has become a huge menace, and it affects food security as well. So we need to also think about how cyclonic storms in this region are also affecting locust invasion or increasing locust invasion in this particular region. In Africa, it's also affecting the Middle East, the West Asia, and this time it has also come to India and other parts of South Asia, Pakistan, and so on. So this is another case that is affecting South Asia in a huge way. I don't have to, really go very deep into this. I think this is something that affects India, that is affecting India and other parts of South Asia in a huge way. Heat waves. We had a heat wave this year itself, and what has happened? Okay, of course, a lot of people were stuck indoors with no air conditioning. Of course, everybody doesn't have access to air conditioning, and this affects the livelihoods. It also affects the lives of people in a big way. So this figure over here shows India alone lost close to 75 billion labor hours in 2017 due to extreme heat, about half the global total of 153 billion hours lost to extreme heat days in the same year. So, so about 80% of those losses in India were in agriculture. So you can imagine that many of these sectors, industrial and agricultural sectors, are affected hugely. Now, what also we must remember is in South Asia, informal economies or informal sectors are huge. Now, in informal sectors, when you have laborers who work under the sun, under the sun, this affects their productivity in a big way. This affects our own productivity in a big way. And that is something that we need to think about when we talk about, climate action, because obviously we are losing a lot of money as well in this process. Yeah. Now, another issue, climate migration. I think this was not really touched upon much in the previous sessions as well. Otherwise, all the other issues were touched upon by Sujata, Jella, Ulka, and even in the last one, wherein Jay and Tushar Ghate, they talked about a whole lot of issues that we can and cannot do in terms of how do we act on climate change. Now, climate migrants, South Asia is, of course, a hotspot. Now, again, there is a problem with the kind of, with how climate change is perceived, or climate migration is perceived for that matter. A whole lot of discussion is about interstate migration, that, okay, Bangladeshi immigrants are coming into India, or other immigrants are moving into some other country. That is not the point here. Most of the immigration or migration is happening internally within countries. And there's a huge internal displacement that has happened over the past couple of decades due to extreme weather events, or due to drought conditions, or due to other kinds of changes in the climate and weather, which have affected the socio-economic sectors or livelihoods of people, and therefore people moving into other parts of the country itself. And that is something I think most people have seen in the case of India as well. And one of the things that is very important to remember here from this report by World Bank, which shows that even with better development and high greenhouse gas emissions, the climate migration would still continue, because whatever developmental gains that you make in the future, they may be completely or partially negated by climate change. And that is why development planning does have to take climate change into consideration if you need sustainable development and growth in the future. Okay. Yeah, so this is a slide which exactly shows, I think, what Vignesh also concluded his presentation by. This graph pretty much shows you where we are in terms of climate denialism or climate skepticism or climate activism or climate champion, so to say. So why is there so much of delay on action at the global level? And I think those discourses that are there in that picture clearly show that, okay, on the one hand, there are many people who just surrender to the fact that climate is too big an issue for me to really act upon. It is not something that people can really control or manage. So it's like a doomsday scenario that most people want to picturize when it comes to climate change and not really act upon it. Of course, some people would like to redirect responsibility. And I think the last question that was posted, the last poll question that was posted, okay, this is not my problem, somebody else should act. Okay, government should be able to provide. But I mean, I completely agree with the fact that you need a structural change. Of course, as individuals, we have a lot to do, we have a lot to contribute. But in the end, we also need to remember that the onus should not be on the most vulnerable people to act and save themselves. There is that structural power and hierarchy that exists within the society, and if you create the problems and let others to solve it for themselves, that is just not ethical in nature. And that is where many people are just being free riders. They are able to go along as the free riders, or what is given as whataboutism. So what about my carbon footprint is too low, I don't need to do anything about it. So the third section is basically those who want to push some action, of course, but it has to be very non-transformative in nature. It's not something that is transformative. They don't want structural changes. They will just believe that, okay, technology can provide some solutions. You can be very rhetorical. Of course, you can go into some solutions like clean coal and so on. And of course, no sticks. Basically, you don't want to penalize anyone for polluting more. Just provide incentives to pollute less. So that is not very transformative in nature. And then you have emphasizing the downsides. Now, if you transition into a low carbon economy, or if you transition into renewable energy, what happens to the people who are working in the coal sector? These are questions that are commonly asked. What about social justice? One of the questions that is asked, okay, what about poverty eradication? Isn't that a much bigger problem than climate change? What we need to remember is that these are not opposite or competing kind of objectives at the end of the day, as was shown in the previous slides as well. My first poll, I have only one poll question. So can I have the poll question, please? Yeah, so this is the question that I wanted to pose in terms of solutions. And I think that is where I'm headed now. What types of solutions are best suited for tackling climate change in South Asia? And I think I think the jury is out. There is a lot of debate on this. Do you need technocratic solutions like building embankments, or other kinds of technical kind of solutions to fighting climate change? Or do you need nature-based solutions like just having wetland conservation, or growing mangroves? Or do you need socio-economic and behavioral solutions where you need community-driven kind of solutions? Or is it legal solutions like carbon tax, or penalizing polluters and so on? So I just wanted to know what the audience would think about in terms of solutions.
All right, the votes are still coming in, but I think it's safe to say that socio-economic and behavioral solutions take a majority of the chunk. So, yeah.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. So, can I go back to the presentation now? Yeah, okay. So, it's an interesting choice, in fact, socio-economic and behavioral solutions. Of course, that is an important. And in fact, let me also say that these are not exactly in silos. Of course, socio-economic solutions can also be nature-based solutions. And that is where community-driven solutions are mostly nature-based solutions. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these nature-based solutions that are being implemented now on a much bigger scale in South Asia. So nature-based solutions for climate, of course, afforestation is something that is most talked about because forests are a carbon sink; they absorb carbon dioxide. So, in terms of carbon dioxide removal, now everybody is talking about negative emissions, right? So most countries now are jumping into negative emissions even before they have fulfilled all the commitments under previous regimes like the Kyoto Protocol. But with negative emissions becoming a huge thing, of course, afforestation will continue to be it will be a priority for governments or for any communities. In fact, grasslands are another factor. Of course, mangroves is something that is commonly known for attenuating storm surges. In fact. And wetlands, which I talked about in the previous slides as well, floodwater retention is something that is very much needed in South Asia, because as we move more and more into wetlands and floodplains, we know that this is just calling for more and more disasters. And mangroves, most of the mangroves, say in Mumbai and other places, have been destroyed to a large extent. And, any storm that comes in that particular area, a storm surge that happens in that particular area, if you have mangroves, that can diminish the threat posed by storm surges and so on. So there is that talk about how do you exactly invest in these projects. So the thing is, it is also about how you frame these issues. And I think it is very important to remember that on the one hand, it is mitigating climate change by reducing tons of carbon dioxide, or you are sequestering the carbon dioxide, or whichever way you want to put it. And on the other hand, it is also reducing your vulnerability to climate hazards. So it is in a way adaptation as well. It is also in a way building resilience for you. And I think this is an important lesson that all of us and corporate sector and businesses need to learn as we go ahead as to where do you need to invest. Technocratic solutions, of course, I'm not saying all of them are bad. Of course, some of them are good. We need them. But in the same way, we also need to make these things more participatory, for instance. We need to make them community driven. If you are having, I'm going to come into that, but if you're having projects without the consent of the people around, it is not going to be a successful venture. And so that is why we need to have nature-based solutions, which are also in a way transformational or transformative in nature. So that is something that is based on ecosystems based approach. And this is another project. This is kind of something that is being implemented to a large extent in regions like northeastern India, for instance, also in Nepal, also in Bangladesh, where the upstream communities, whether they are indigenous peoples or it may be other communities, rural communities, who are the stewards and providers of watershed services, for instance. So ecosystem services. Ecosystem services simply means, how do you benefit from the ecosystem, right? So any project that is implemented in such a manner wherein you pay for the ecosystem, so the downstream water users should be able to pay the upstream community for the ecosystem services they provide. So it can be in terms of assistance, materials, or cash, direct cash transfer. Like some of the Indian states like Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh, they have been asking for payment for their ecosystem services because they have kept the forest intact, right? So this is something that is going to become more and more popular in the near future, because I think this is important that you value the resources and the ecosystems that you depend on. Okay. Another major solution that is being implemented in countries like Bangladesh and to an extent even in Nepal is forecast-based financing. And I think this is an important and very interesting intervention that has happened, that most people would like to act on a disaster after the disaster happens, so post-disaster reconstruction. Vignesh talked about disaster risk reduction, and I think forecast-based financing is a means of achieving that. So there are, of course, different phases in how do you really finance, finance any project or finance any kind of intervention even before the disaster hits. So you need early warning systems in place. So you need to be able to figure out what may happen, say 10 days down the line or 15 days down the line. If a cyclone is approaching, can you trigger this forecast-based financing mechanism way ahead of time so that you are able to provide, say, direct cash transfers to the people who may be most affected by it, who may have to evacuate from the place, who may lose their livelihoods. So these are the questions that are being asked constantly, that are you able to help the people who are most affected by these changes that happen in the environment because of especially extreme weather events. Now, there is another interesting factors about impact based forecasting that is also happening now. Insurance sector has been affected a lot by this, because how do you access the insurance schemes? Does the money really come to you even though you pay all the premiums in time? Is the cost regulated in such a way that you are at an advantage? So that is something that is being constantly asked as well. And I think based on forecasting, impact based forecasting, as to how much farmers are affected by, say, a particular flooding event or a drought event, is something that is already, so there is like a trigger point at which these mechanisms are really triggered. So yeah, so risk scenarios, hazards, vulnerability, and capacities, all these aspects are analyzed over a period of time. The available forecast, that is where climate information becomes extremely important. We again, we do not have that many business models for how do you exactly make something like climate services or climate information viable enough. So what are the danger levels? Now, one of the questions that comes up in terms of forecast-based financing is, okay, you forecast a cyclone 10 days in advance, and then you prepare for the eventuality, and then you implement some projects in order to make sure that people cope with these changes. Maybe they build some infrastructure, or they made some kind of changes, socio-economic changes within the communities in order to make sure that they can cope with the kind of disaster that is yet to occur. And then maybe 7 days down the line, the disaster may not really strike. Maybe the cyclone just deviated and moved in another direction. And then you can some people would become really skeptical of this whole exercise and say that, okay, what is the point? We've invested so much in this exercise, but the cyclone never really struck the area. And I think that is a very wrong way to approach this problem. Why I'm saying this? Because whatever investments you make in terms of transformationally changing a particular sector or a society will always come into use in the future as well. So we need to think long term. Now, that is where these kind of financial mechanisms will work. You need to think in the long term. Now, and just to give as an example here, I have taken this from the Food and Agriculture Organization, from the World Food Program. This is, these are some of the districts in which Nepal had implemented the forecast-based financing mechanism. This was also done in Bangladesh. In fact, during Amphan, Bangladesh's losses were much lower than India's. And one of the reasons why that was the case, even though the cyclone was equally disastrous in Bangladesh, is because apparently they could implement the forecast-based financing and help the people cope with the losses even before the disaster had struck. So you can see how much of cost savings you can actually make in terms of, 22 million US dollars is what they ended up saving because of investing in such a venture. And I think this is an important lesson that we need to learn as well, as to, how do you really think about economics is very important. Sometimes we think about it in a very, very narrow and short-term way, and that is not going to help us in the long term. I think this has been touched upon by Ulka. Cleo also mentioned about how India could become the solar manufacturing hub, the rooftop manufacturing hub, especially because of the coronavirus pandemic. Of course, India's solar capacity has increased over a period of time. There has been a lull this year, but then, of course, we are hoping that things would pick up once the pandemic kind of subsides. Government is, planning to build more and more renewable energy equipment, manufacturing renewable energy equipment in India, so that we can kind of cut off the supplies with the supply chain that we are so dependent on China. So that is interesting to note that these kind of initiatives are already being made. But renewable energy is one area in which I think the government, especially the Indian government and other governments in the region, are becoming more and more vocal. Now, where the problem lies, and I think that is where we need to focus as well, as much as we think of expanding renewable energy. Of course, this is another technocratic solution that may go all awry if we are not going to take into consideration issues like land conflicts. And this particular tweet just caught my attention, wherein this huge solar park that is going to come, how this is affecting the great Indian bustard, the bird, and how great Indian bustard, I'm sorry, and also how it is going to affect the locals who have dependent on this land for grazing, right? So the land conflicts, then this is where I was saying that you need to take the people on the ground as well into consideration. So business interventions, financial interventions, government interventions, none of these can work in the long term if you don't take people into confidence as well as to how they can benefit from the same project that you think is going to benefit the whole country as such, right? Another example, afforestation, it's a great nature-based solution. But again, if you're going to keep the indigenous communities out of the decision making, and then you make a decision based on your understanding of how afforestation is good for the country, again, this may run into a lot of troubles in the future. So, threatens India's indigenous communities who afforestation program in Chhattisgarh, which is leading to a lot of conflicts between the state and the people. Another aspect is about how many people are really dependent on sectors like coal, and that is where aspects like just transition will definitely come into picture. There's a huge coal chain. The value chain that we're talking about is huge. It starts from the mining sector. It also goes to the power sector. It also goes to the electricity sector. So all these sectors are dependent on it, and you have so many livelihoods that are hinged on the coal sector. So the just transition becomes equally important. So of course, the renewable energy sector can produce a lot of jobs, as Ulka also mentioned in her presentation in the last webinar. But how do you make sure that people who were in the coal sector are rehabilitated and maybe shifted to renewable sector? And at the same time, how do these hierarchies or how do you ensure that the hierarchies that are existent in the power sector are also kind of demolished, so that it becomes more democratized and more decentralized in nature? And that becomes important as we move ahead. Okay, so just to conclude, actually, I have just a couple of more slides here, which talk about. So Vignesh talked about conflicts and changing nature of conflicts, and I think as much as we talk about solutions and more solutions, we also need to think about how these solutions may trigger different kinds of problems for us in the long term. And I think that is where backdraft, it's a concept that was introduced in this book that I've quoted here. And it talks about how adaptation and mitigation measures can actually lead to more conflicts, as we have seen in the case of, even in the last slide, as I showed you. And that's where conflict sensitivity becomes very important. Now you have in Africa, there's an ongoing in many countries, including in Sahel region that Suraj mentioned. You have an ongoing conflict between the pastoralists and the agriculturalists, and how is that? How are you really implementing projects is something very important in terms of how the benefits are accrued by these projects as well. So conflict sensitivity is important in terms of how do you ensure institutional support by the governments and other institutions around. You should be able to work with different stakeholders, both inside and outside the government.
I once again urge the audience to ask questions. We have a lot coming in, and these are really interesting questions, and I'm sure our speakers would love to address them. So kindly keep your questions coming. And meanwhile, we're working on getting Dr. Dhanashree back. Yeah, hi, welcome back.
Internet here, so I'm just going to keep the camera off for a while, and then I'll finish the presentation anyway. Okay.
Sounds good.
Yeah, okay. So as I mentioned, conflict sensitivity is where I think integrating adaptation measures into countries' development initiatives and poverty reduction campaigns, that also becomes important. Of course, adaptation means different in different contexts, and that is, if you actually read most of the projects or business interventions, they define adaptation according to their convenience most of the time. Most of the time that happens, that investments depend on what kind of interventions you want. And adaptation has a very, very broad kind of understanding, a broad definition as far as the UNFCCC, the Climate Change Convention, is concerned. At the same time, regional cooperation is very important, even in a region like South Asia. Most of the things cannot be achieved without regional cooperation. And of course, civil society and decision makers have to be included. And lastly, identifying the sectors of society critically affected by climate change. So these are some of the important factors that we need to take into consideration for understanding climate and conflict sensitivity at the same time. I would like to end with this slide on ICIMOD, which is the Integrated Center for Integrated Mountain Development. And I think this is where we need to probably go a little bit beyond governments. Of course, governments are very important, but there are other transnational networks like ICIMOD, which are doing some great work as far as provision of climate information and services is concerned. And I think business models for climate information is something that is budding kind of area that is coming up with the use of digital technologies and helping farmers cope with changes in climate and prepare for various kinds of eventualities that is happening. And this is one of the initiatives they are running at the regional level, because Hindu Kush Himalayan region is not just one country's property. It runs across a big region, and it covers countries like it covers countries from Pakistan to Bhutan, Nepal, India. So you have a whole lot of these countries which are part of this region, and it is important to have some kind of coordination between them as far as managing the changes in the Himalayas are concerned. So yeah, this is the example that I wanted to give of going just beyond the governments as well. But I'm happy to take questions, and if you haven't watched some of the earlier webinars, please go online and watch them. We will be putting up the last two webinars as well very soon. And some of these issues which I have mentioned here were also touched upon by some of the previous presenters. And I would be happy to take questions. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dhanashree. That was a really interesting presentation, actually. So I'll just go over some key takeaways. Meanwhile, again, I urge the audience to ask questions. And if you want the question to be answered by one particular speaker, kindly direct your questions towards them. Going over the key takeaway points, you spoke on the climate projection report, where you stated the 6 factors that are, expected to be affected the most. And over there, and all 6 of them were very key, important factors. And leaving the second line alone, where it spoke about human health, loss of ecosystems, and infrastructure and industry. First 3, there is agriculture, fisheries, and water, very vital for our survival. That alone should tell you how great this impact is going to be. I mean, if you can't do without water and agriculture industry, all your food sources from there. And then you spoke on the land encroachment. You took examples from Assam, Bihar, and Bangladesh. Then you also covered the groundwater extraction, whereby we have the land sinking in a lot of places, and that is causing a lot of trouble. And it was very interesting for you to cover the locust problem, actually. That is being very severe right now, and it is a very trending problem in social media as well. A lot of people are speaking about it, so that's been a big problem. And of course, all of this in all of this, climate change has a major factor to play. And next, you covered climate migration, and a very important topic you covered was the discourse on climate change, actually. And I think this is, time and again being covered by a lot of people, and it's very interesting. Some of the, some of the words that he used over here. One was how people often think that climate change and its effects is somewhat a doomsday situation. It occurs only in the end. We are going to face the problems only in the end. And a lot of people are also oblivious to the fact that it's happening right now and in our lifetime. It's not that it's going to happen in later lifetimes, or in the future generations alone. We will be facing problems if it goes on in this accelerated pace of warming and loss of biodiversity and ecosystem. And another interesting thing you said was, a lot of people say that technology will take care of it. But again, over here, might not be the best example, but again, over here, I bring to the attention of the COVID-19 problem, saying that, technology this, technology that, but unfortunately, technology is not able to keep up with the pace, and we are still looking for solutions. And the world is still facing a lot of problems, sporadic lockdowns and whatnot, and you have your politicians coming up openly and saying that another lockdown will not do for the economy. So how exactly is technology helping you? So I just want to bring to attention to the fact that these are problems that are happening right now, and I think coordinated effort from all of us is very much needed. Then it was really nice of you to cover some of the solutions. You spoke on a lot of solutions, and this, I think, is very important. Many people just like to speak about the problems and with good intentions, but of course, covering what solutions can be taken, what's going on right now, is very important. And to that extent, you covered the IC mod, where you were saying, and I think that was a very important point you covered towards the end, saying how we should not just expect government to do something or look at governmental institutions. There are, of course, a lot of other institutions on this planet that are working towards building sustainable development and helping the problem against climate change. And this might be my unpopular opinion, but I just feel like we're not paying a lot of attention to it, and we're not giving a lot of resources to it as much as it should be given. It's something that you also covered in your climate course, the climate change discourse, where you said a lot of people want to make changes, but they don't want to be overt about it. They're just like, okay, my carbon footprint is low, I am not doing this, I'm keeping my plastic usage to the minimum. But that's just not enough. Ultimately, when millions of other people are doing the opposite things, the effect is going to come on you as well. No matter how less your carbon footprint is, you alone with a least carbon footprint, it's not like you're going to isolate yourself from the climate change and the problems associated with it. So yeah, I mean, it was a great presentation from both the speakers, and ultimately what can be seen here is that unless we all take a coordinated effort towards it, we cannot really isolate from ourselves from this problem. So yeah, that's the need of the hour. So we'll go ahead with the questions. Right now, we have a lot of questions coming in from both the speakers. Just give me a couple of minutes. All right, so we have our first question here. It's, I believe, for both the speakers. So internal and external migration is one major geopolitical and geoeconomic risk caused due to climate change. In South Asia, countries like Bangladesh are suffering from the same. So how can the region take up actions to this issue and in a cooperative manner?
Yeah, I mean, since the question is on South Asia, I guess I'll go. I'll just answer it. As I mentioned, even in my presentation, a lot has to do with internal displacement, what I mentioned very clearly. And that is something that is being dealt. I mean, for sure, in a country like Bangladesh, like I said, the preparedness has increased a lot more in the recent past. Which is the same thing that you will see in a state like Odisha. Like, the preparedness to handle cyclone response has improved so much in the past 2 decades. It's the same situation in Bangladesh with repeated cyclones and floods and everything. Internal displacement has become a phenomenon. It's the same in Assam as well. In fact, people move to one part of Assam, then Brahmaputra engulfs that part, then they move to another part. So it has become rather a coping mechanism. Migration is always not negative that way. Sometimes it's a coping mechanism that might work. Instead of living in a floodplain, you might as well migrate to another area which is less susceptible or vulnerable to climate change. So that's perfectly fine. Regionally, of course, this is a very, very controversial issue. I think illegal immigration from Bangladesh to India has become such an important issue to tackle that you don't want to put another issue in that basket and say, okay, climate migrants, let them come into India. And that becomes more politically as well. That becomes more political issue than socio-economic issue. It has become a political issue, in fact. In fact, in terms of migration, between India and Bangladesh, there is no mechanism to deal with illegal immigration except through the human trafficking laws. In fact, so there is the denial as well to a large extent as to, okay, how many illegal immigrants have come in, and how many have moved because of environmental reasons. That is also something we do not know. Those kind of figures do not exist, but there is a lot more data gathering internally. And I think that is where we need to focus. There are so many people who are moving from the coastal areas of Bangladesh to cities like Dhaka and Chittagong, and huge numbers. Dhaka is overpopulated. They cannot really deal with so many people moving into the city, and it's overpopulated, overcrowded, resource crunched to a large extent. And now you're trying to find other suburban areas, urban areas. Chittagong has become the next city to, for people to move in. So that has become a huge issue. And I think most of the development agencies or aid agencies or, those UNDP, UNEP, mostly UNDP projects related to adaptation, they also keep in mind the migration aspect. And that becomes important at the national level. But at the regional level, unfortunately, so far, there is no mechanism to deal with migration of any kind. It's more like an ad hoc kind of intervention that happens. Okay, India has accepted immigrants, refugees from Sri Lanka or Tibet or other parts of the region, but that is probably not something that can be applied in the case of climate migration, because there is no overtly political issue involved here. It's not some kind of a suppression or oppression, political oppression that has happened in those countries. So we have to wait and see how this will be dealt with in the future. But it's better to have something in place now itself, because it might already be happening and we don't know about it since there is no data.
All right. Thank you for that. We have the next question right now. The one participant is asking about, he wants to get a clear idea about the elephant in the room, that is factory animal farming, animal agriculture in general, which is the top contributors to the global warming directly and indirectly, resulting in climate change. When are we going to tackle this low-hanging fruit? What measures do you think can be taken to mitigate this issue?
Who wants to go?
Yeah, Dhanashree, go ahead.
I don't have much of a solution to offer in this sector. I haven't really studied this sector too much, but definitely this is a huge contributor. I think everybody knows that cattle rearing and animal husbandry, the industry, the beef industry, so-called beef industry in the Western countries, it's a huge contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, methane especially. And methane has a much bigger global warming potential than carbon dioxide. But of course, carbon dioxide remains in the atmosphere for a much longer time. So, you can compare and contrast all these factors. But, of course, this is an industry that thrives on consumer choices and consumption as well, So we have to remember that. And as far as, India's methane contributions are concerned, it's mostly from the agricultural sector. because again, cultivation of crops, all these also causes methane emissions. But mostly the animal farming industry, the animal husbandry industry, which contributes a lot to emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, is from the Western countries. And I think it has a lot to do with consumer choices, which have to change. And I think it's already changing to some extent, at least in some pockets. But it may not have a huge impact in the near future. So even if you shut down all the industries there, they're already kind of importing meat from African countries, other countries where it's fine. There are not huge legal norms that are put in place. So you might have laws in Europe which completely are trying to put a full stop on animal husbandry industry, but they're still kind of importing it from other countries. I mean, I want to actually add to Vignesh's presentation about the palm oil, right? So there's a huge hypocrisy involved in this issue. So you have European Union which wants to ban all palm oil products, of especially biofuels produced by palm oil, all of a sudden. And after making ASEAN countries completely dependent on the EU market for such a long time, so there comes a geo-economic question as well. You can't suddenly say that, okay, we're going to ban it. And of course, ASEAN may not care as much. Of course, it's a huge market. The European market is huge, but there are other buyers. Chinese might come, Indians might buy. So it's we don't have any problems with buying palm oil from ASEAN. So it's a structural problem as well. You can't ban something and expect things to change over time. Yeah.
Dr. Vignesh, you have anything on this?
No, in fact, Tanushree is right in terms of talking about a consumer-led model. There can be mass production of things when there is actually a demand. And basically, as consumer choices change, or for that matter, if we are looking at the global scenario, if certain countries have conflicts with each other, the first things which get banned are things like this. There are certain markets like the EU, for instance, which heavily subsidize various industries such as agriculture, or there are various other things. So it's not so simple in terms of just banning something or asking another country to reduce it, because if it makes economic sense for them, they are not going to do it unless there is a real pressing issue which affects them. And this is what happened in terms of why countries in Southeast Asia were compelled to act against companies which were involved in palm oil production in Indonesia. So they had to enact laws, or enact the laws or implement them in a stricter way, so that they could penalize companies, Singaporean companies or Malaysian companies for that matter, who were operating from Indonesia, saying that you will have to pay a penalty if you encourage this kind of a thing, where the haze comes out and affects across the Malacca Strait into the region. So again, there are possibly two ways of looking at this. One is about countries themselves, the governments taking action to move towards a more sustainable process, or for that matter, consumers changing their choice. And I think the later actually requires a lot of persuasion than the former, is what I feel in terms of looking at it.
Right. Thank you for that. We have the next question here. How can governments and businesses ensure a more participatory approach to ensure that the effect of climate change can be mitigated at a local or on-ground level to protect vulnerable groups? How are the frameworks that govern this?
Okay. Should I answer that?
So, I mean, I just, yeah, shall I take it, Dhanashree? In fact, I wanted to talk about something that you mentioned in your presentation, and that was a really fantastic statement. In fact, saying that we can't expect everybody to take the responsibility and then expect also the vulnerable sections of society to comply to it and pay the price when they really don't have the resources or the ability to comply with it. Though they may have the intentions, but intentions don't go a long way if you don't have the other aspects to support you. So I do agree with that. But something that I could take away also from the previous presentations is that we need not wait for the government always to tell us what to do and then start implementing. here, of course, if there are subsidies which are provided in terms of having solar plants, or having rooftops solar, and buying solar, installing solar equipment. If those subsidies are provided, then definitely that does make the economic sense, and that gives an incentive. Buying an electric car, for instance, that gives if there is an incentive, someone will buy it. And taking from the last presentation, also the last session, in fact, one interesting thing was about forming a cooperative sort of a model, where at a ground level, people can start with implementing the change at local levels. And that is a way in which you do not need to depend on a larger entity like the government to support you. And I think a private partnership model in this, with communities or societies, will also is a type of a win-win situation in that sense.
All right. Okay, we'll move on to our next question. This question is related to the climate change violence nexus, especially looking from the perspective of terror outfits. Due to the change in climate, a lot of terror outfits have taken this as a recruitment opportunity. With growing impact of climate change and looming international support, how can we see it going forward? In terms of the climate change violence nexus, and what approaches can the government take when it comes to curbing the climate change impact simultaneously with religious extremism?
Yeah. Shall I take that question?
Please go ahead.
Yeah. It's an interesting point, and I would recommend you to read. Maybe self-promotion, but I have written a report on South Asia and the risk associated with climate fragility in South Asia, and this is one of the risks that I've mentioned. And of course, there are very little. There are very little studies done on this aspect, because if you look at disasters that have happened in countries like Pakistan, and most of the time, usually it's groups like Jamaat Dawa that steps in and provides relief and reconstruction and all kinds of support to the local communities, even before the government steps in. Similar way, in fact, even after the Indian Ocean tsunami happened, some of these groups, Jamaat Dawa, which is like a, I don't know, it's basically Lashkar-e-Taiba only, which sent its troops, which sent its people to a country like Maldives to support people there. And of course, that is not the end of the story, right? So it is also a way of recruiting people afterwards. That, okay, the government couldn't provide you anything. It's us that came in the right time and provided you support. And that kind of nexus that is there between climate change. Of course, these disasters are not always caused by climate change. They may be triggered by climate change. They may be exacerbated by climate change. And I also wanted to point out something that Vignesh mentioned about natural disaster. And I think I have a slight problem with the term natural disasters, because disasters are never natural. And I think there is, that understanding has come in that disasters, of course, natural hazards can be natural, but disasters are almost always human made. It's always due to some kind of structural kind of issues, or some kind of problems with the way you have built infrastructure, or with the way your communities have spread out in regions where you should not be living. So these factors always come in. So the human made factor comes in there. And of course, in terms of violence, let me come back to the question of violence. And I think there are more studies now being done on Africa, especially in the Sahel region is one such region which is heavily affected by climate change, and how that feeds a lot into insecurity and violence, and how that helps some of these terrorist organizations or extremist organizations to recruit people. And that is becoming rather common. In South Asia, there is not much of evidence to show that, but there are some instances, as I mentioned, and of course, this might become a problem in the future in this region, and it's already happening in other regions like Africa. And the whole discourse on climate change and conflict, there's a lot of problems with how it is framed, but at the same time, we also have to acknowledge the linkages and act upon them.
Dr. Vignesh, anything you would like to add?
In fact, just on the aspect actually of how do we classify or how do we look at persons affected by the effect of climate change or the let's say the loss of biodiversity or any other factors. There is, of course, me and Dhanushya have been discussing this for a very long time, and definitely at an international level, there is no consensus in terms of if there can be climate refugees or are there climate refugees, because at one point of time. Like Dhanushri also pointed out before, there have been instances where people are at places where they shouldn't have been, like she said, and if they are affected by severe weather events or natural hazards, I'll correct myself now, and they are forced to relocate within the country or across national borders. So how do you consider them, and to what extent? Because they are not fleeing violence per se, and they are also not migrating because of economic reasons. So whether you classify, how will you classify them is a question. And in fact, I've been reading. I had read a very interesting observation, which an individual from the island of Kiribati had migrated to New Zealand on account of his island being submerged because of sea level rise. And the UNHCR actually said that he can't be deported back to Kiribati. And so, does he really classify as one of the first climate refugees who had to migrate because, a part of it? So that need not really classify, or there is no real consensus on that point. But definitely, I think over a point of time, these are questions to ponder upon, because as to what happens when, I mean, in a way, it might just solve many of the maritime territorial disputes when disputed areas don't exist anymore. But in a sense, what happens to things like the exclusive economic zones or the areas which are governed by certain nation states, and they don't exist anymore? What do you do about those? Are some important questions.
Right. So we have just two more questions before we go to the conclusion. So here's the second last one. So now, in this presentation, we spoke about business and, the impact of climate change on business. So this question, concerns with what these businesses are doing. So you see a lot of corporate companies, sending their employees off on the weekends to pick up trash from the beach. And they have a lot of other probably cleanup drives. You say one road in front of the office, go clean up the trash over there, and things like that. And of course, it might be fun to go over the weekends with your colleagues and clean up all that stuff. But while you are still doing that, your office in the background is running, all the electronic items still running in the background, and that is computer contributing significantly to a lot of global warming and climate change as an effect. So I mean, it's a little clear. I mean, they want to show like they're doing something in the in outside, but they're actually not doing anything behind the behind the doors, right? So what do you think will be the future? What do you think the future will be like? Will corporates actually start taking proper actions, or what would lead them to take proper actions to actually address these problems?
Okay, just to say a couple of points. I think some of these actions are, of course, and like I think in the last presentation by Jay Kumar Gaurav, in fact, he presented factors that guide businesses and corporate sector to take up climate action. And I think some of course, risks associated with climate change covers issues like reputation as well. The problem now is that most of the aspects of climate action are being covered through corporate social responsibility. And I think we have to move out of that now. Like, I think enough of just trying to make corporate sector responsible for their own actions or making them more accountable. I think it was also about complying with the regulations that the government has put. And that is where regulations and government becomes very important. Very often what happens is, with the kind of regulations that come in, most companies, most businesses have to comply with them. And with that, most of these companies will have to mitigate climate action. They will have to bring in some kind of a change in their business model, or some kind of structural changes, or some kind of operational changes, at least, to make sure that they also contribute to climate action. And that is becoming important, more and more important. I mean, you can see so many new announcements being made by Microsoft, Google, or those big companies are already on that way. Microsoft is already talking about negative emissions. This is the only corporate firm which is talking about it, I guess. So I mean, I'm sure there are others also, but this is the biggest one that is talking about it. So they are going to invest in negative carbon emissions technologies, or carbon dioxide removal technologies as well. So I think that will drive a lot of technological change as well. It is happening, but on a very, very slow scale. Yeah.
All right. So we have the last question now, and I think this is a little interesting actually. So this particular question is about will climate change and the effects of global warming, would it become a new normal for us, despite any sort of adaptation or mitigation efforts? Would we reach a point of no return where it would then become a new normal for us? And how would that really look like? I mean, how would this planet look like in that case?
Yeah, Dhanashree, I think we leave the last word with the climate expert to give the answer on this.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So I don't know. It's a very open question to answer. Honestly, I don't know how to answer it. Of course, it's a new normal, as in things have already changed. I don't think most of the changes that have happened in the climate can be reversed any longer. So we have crossed that threshold already. That is why we are talking about adaptation. Otherwise, the whole discussion would have been just on mitigation, right? So you're already trying to adapt. You're trying to build resilience. You are trying to do so many other things that are preparing you to live with this new normal. I think the pandemic has already kind of taught us what the new normal is. Climate change already, I think it already kicked in that new normal, but people were still very slow on realizing that, because probably because of what I mentioned. There are different sections of people who belong to different kind of thinkings, or they have different kinds of mindsets to relate to this climate change. So new normal is already here, and I think we are all learning to live with it in different ways, and it is happening at all levels. Like, it is happening in all sectors as well. And I think that preparedness, or the anticipatory kind of approach, is what is coming in. Of course, it is slow. I'm not saying that this is happening on a massive scale, that everybody is learning to cope with climate change or trying to do anything on climate change. That is not what I'm saying. But I think that emergency, the climate emergency, what we talk about, that is something that is being talked about so much in the newspaper articles, all these protests that are happening across cities. I mean, right now it's not happening, but it was happening until the COVID-19 hit the world. But you will see that climate emergency, water emergency, all those issues have come to the forefront. And this is becoming major issues, as much as of course, the protectionist values, populist values are also becoming very, very strong. But it's an interesting time to live in. I don't know how to really say, because the new normal is already here. That is all I can say. But how we cope with it is going to depend on how far we are interested in taking action, and also urging governments and other sectors to really act. I think individual action also kind of depends on that. Individual action is not just switching off the lights and fans to save energy. It is also about how far you can press the government and other sectors to act on climate change. And that is what some of these societies have been kind of successful in doing to some extent, at least in Europe and a few other countries. And I think in India as well, we can do that with a lot more collective action. That of course starts with individual action.
Right. And yeah, like you said, oh yeah, just switching off fans and light. I think we are a decade late to consider that as the most important thing to be doing here to save this planet. But yeah, but still very important nonetheless. It is always good to switch off your lights and fans when
Yeah.
it's not in use. But yeah, that was great, Dhanashree. Thank you so much. I'll go to the concluding statements now. I'd just like to thank our participants for all their questions. You've been a great audience. In case we didn't answer any of your questions due to the paucity of time, please reach out to us via email and we'll be happy to forward your questions to the speakers. Before we conclude for the day, I have a couple of important announcements to make. The much awaited final webinar session on the series Approach and Applicability, the Best Practices in Counterterrorism will be held on Saturday, 25th July at 6:30 p.m. IST. So make sure you register for it and you acquire your participation certificate. Finally, please spare us a few more minutes of your time. This is our third webinar series and we value your feedback. There will be a poll that will appear on your screen in just a few seconds. It's just a few questions, so we request all of you to fill it up. So yeah, I will have the poll questions on your screen in some time. Yeah, here it is. Kindly answer all the questions and you can click the submit button at the end of your screen. Once again, thank you so much for your participation. Kindly answer these feedback questions and click the submit button at the end of the page. And with that, we conclude today's webinar on political risk, businesses and climate change, cases from South and Southeast Asia. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our speakers, Dr. Vignesh Ram and Dr. Dhanashree Jairam, for sharing their insight and knowledge on the topic. It's been a pleasure to host you. On behalf of the entire team at Covens, I would like to thank all the participants for showing their support by joining the session today. Covens, PRISM, and the Center for Climate Studies at Manipal hope to see you all in our future webinars as well. Now, before we shut this webinar, our CEO, Mr. Swapnil Kishore, would like to say a few words. Swapnil, you're on.
Thank you, Suraj. First of all, I would like to thank all of our participants. Without them, we would have not been possible to perform such a great extent. You have asked a lot of interesting question. I have been witnessing and I was going through all the questions. I really liked all the participants' curiosity and their enthusiasm, the way they have joined with us. Apart from that, I am also thankful to all of our speakers for sharing their knowledge, for sharing all the solutions, possible solutions, to guiding all the participants where we can come up with the solutions into the climate change, the impact what we are facing. And last, Dr. Dhanashree, please accept our sincere thanks for the excellent support provided by you and your Climate Center of Studies, Mahe. Your efforts contributed substantially to the quality of the meeting, and the effectiveness of the interchange was enhanced by the professionalism displayed by you and the center. And I'm really looking forward, Dr. Dhanashree, that we are going to, come up with some certain another professional certificates in terms of climate change, where we can display the real solutions and the real practical things with the participants, and we can enhance their skills how to go and develop the businesses into that part. And the last but not the least, I cannot thank any of my entire team, especially Dr. Vignesh, who has kept on working without failing any time. He was kept on working like day and night throughout, and rest of my team who have given all the times day and night at the back end process. So thank you so much, and I'm really looking forward once again to meet on Saturday for our counterterrorism webinar to finish it off. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dhanashree.
Yeah,
Right.
thank you.
Like
Thank you,
Mr.
everyone.
Swapnil said, the participants are the reason actually we are.
Yes, Suraj.
Again, thank you to the participants, and kindly reach out to us if you would like to know more about our various products and services. You can also get in touch via our social media platforms on. Yes, sir.
No, your voice was getting stuck, so that's why. Yep. Please continue.
I think there's a slight lag from
Yes.
his side.
Okay, I think there is a slight lag. Yeah. Heavy rainfall here, so might be some sort of network problem. But anyway, like I was saying, we look forward to seeing you guys again, and thank you so much. And wherever you are, stay safe and have a good night. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.